Resident Evil, a franchise that garners interest the world over. However, today's topic is about the black sheep of the genre. Resident Evil 5. Scarcely do companies make games with such mundane appraisal and overall controversy. In fact, it wasn't until the 6th entry in the numbered titles that the speculation and controversy over this particular title would die down. While some regard this as a campy, fun, overall enjoyable experience, there are others that say this title marked the downfall in the survival horror giant, Resident Evil. But why was that? On paper, the game bolstered several key elements that would draw anyone if pitched correctly. Where did the development and style of this monolithic entry go so wrong? Why did the game fall so far from its initial reception as the go-to cooperative experience? It is in that question that our episode begins. The initial development of Resident Evil 5 was revealed when it was announced in 2005, the same year that Resident Evil 4 was released, albeit a few months apart. The 4th entry made itself known in January, while the 5th was announced in July. In March of 2009, Resident Evil 5 released for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and later, Microsoft Windows in September. The game followed longtime protagonist of the series Chris Redfield in his journey against bioterrorism, now working for the anti-terrorism unit titled aptly the BSAA, or Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance. Dispatched to Kijuju in West Africa, the agent would be investigating reports of a new bioterrorist attack, sweeping the nation along with his new partner, Sheva Alomar. They were tasked with capturing and interrogating Ricardo Irving, a businessman with standards.
Oh, I'm not like them. I'm a businessman with standards.
Irving was working to sell a new bioorganic weapon, or BOW for short, to an unknown third party in the underground black market. However, upon arriving, the duo realizes that the nation has already become afflicted with this deadly virus. Chris himself quotes that the virus is similar to the Kennedy report, and that the infection was resemblant to the plagas the Los Illuminados used in Europe. Though it didn't seem that the new threat created a hive mind so much as a susceptible mind and volatile army of soldiers prone to violence. These infected were referred to as Genie. Later on in the story, it's revealed that Alpha Team, the ground and air support sent in prior to Chris and Sheva's deployment, was killed in action by the local threats. Fighting their way through West Africa, Chris and Sheva encounter Bravo Team led by a friend of Sheva's named Josh Stone. More so than that, it's revealed that Sheva and Josh share a sibling-like relationship due to Josh being her mentor in training. Moving forward, Chris sees the notes Bravo Team has acquired, and in doing so notices an odd photograph of a blonde woman. It turns out Chris remembers the face of this woman as none other than the series poster girl, Jill Valentine. And boy does she look like she could use a sandwich. Roll the clip.
Barry, help me please. The door won't open. Quick!
Stay away from the door, Jill. I'm gonna kick this door down. Hurry! This way!
Oh, Barry!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill sandwich.
You're right. Barry, thanks for saving my life.
Chris and Jill worked together during the events of the first game, and Jill, later, had a standalone appearance in the 3rd entry, Nemesis. Apparently, during the time gap between 3 and 5, Jill went MIA, so the player can surmise from Chris's insightful dialogue with Sheva. Chris and Sheva make their way through even more trials to eventually encounter Albert Wesker, who is once again proven to be alive, and can only spare 7 minutes.
7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I can spare to play with you.
And is accompanied by a hooded figure who reveals herself as Jill Valentine, though she's being mind-controlled by some form of the thus-titled Ouroboros virus, not one ingested, as the others have been shown to use, but for some reason, hers is a biological piece of technology overriding her will, because reasons. Also, Wesker had her hair dyed blonde, again, for reasons. Moving forward, Chris and Sheva board a ship that's carrying samples of Ouroboros, and not just that, after fighting their way through co-conspirator Excella, who was aptly betrayed, much to no one's surprise, by Albert Wesker, professional bad guy trademark. After defeating Excella with the locally available and conveniently placed space laser, TM, Chris and Sheva quickly rush in for an encounter with Wesker face-to-face, making their way onto the Blackbird that Wesker has stolen or possibly legally purchased TM from the US military despite the device's decommissioning. I guess they had nothing better to do with it. Upon boarding the Blackbird, Wesker attacks the duo, and a quick-time event ensues. Eventually, Wesker penetrates the payload, perpetually contaminates himself with the parasite, resulting in Sheva giving herself up as a sacrifice to kill Wesker via the open airlock that they almost all certainly died to. Except, Chris has a flashback and saves her, and Wesker at the last second, wherein Sheva apparently finds her will to live at the very last second, instead opting to do the smart thing, shooting Wesker in the face to make him let go of her leg. The two go careening into a volcano, which I can only assume is Mount Nyiragongo, because it wasn't listed on the wiki, and also it was the first one I found on Google. Anyways, a fight goes down, Chris punches his way into video game infamy, Sheva struggles to do a pull-up, and Wesker gets a double dose of rocket-propelled justice. They fly away in a helicopter, having defeated the threat. America. Okay, so now that the summary is done, let's get into why this game failed, or one is so controversial to begin with. So, Cliff Note versions of what we're seeing here. Chris was initially supposed to infiltrate Kijuju alone. Sheva Alomar wasn't even a character at the time of the initial trailer release, which you see on screen now. And slightly after that, they brought her in as a second player character? No, as an NPC that would take the role of Chris's contact with the local rebellion against not only the government, but the obvious infection careening out of control in her home. She was also allegedly to be captured and possibly killed during the course of the game, probably an homage to the fact that Chris isn't allowed to have nice things, like a partner, or a team, or mental health. It wasn't until much later that she decided to swap to the BSAA team mid-match, and during the switch, Chris took some creatine and bulked up for his fight with Dwayne Johnson later in the volcano, the true final boss. Going deep into the analysis of this trailer, we can see that while the enemy design hasn't changed too much, they could do a few more things, like grab the player from behind, throw them to the ground, or even get disoriented by what appears to be a dodge mechanic that was scrapped and later used in Resident Evil 3 Remake. Jill told Chris about this, and he abruptly removed it from his repertoire of skills, out of respect for his partner. During the DLC, Lost in Nightmares, we were initially supposed to have a small jab at Chris from Jill herself, about Chris having a crush on a younger co-worker, possibly Rebecca Chambers, which would make sense since Wesker hates Chris so much, and we all know how Wesker feels about Rebecca. Originally, we can see this in one of the earlier trailers of the game. Jill was supposed to be found in one of those weird cryogenetic pod things, incubators? Anyways, this was scrapped as Jill was instead slapped into a skin-tight suit and put under Wesker's command. Initially, Excella wasn't meant to be Tricell's CEO. Instead, Wesker was supposed to attend the CEO, only to kill him in front of Excella and use his obvious charm to seduce her into accompanying him for the duration of his plans. That worked out well for her. Now, most among the series probably remember Barry Burton. Those new might know him from my sandwich joke earlier. He was supposed to not only be present in the game, but play a pivotal role during a cut piece of content involving several El Gigante-esque monsters being released into the central town. The huge fight between BOWs and BSA was supposed to ensue after that. Josh, Jill, Chris, and Barry were all supposed to be involved, but the entire event was scrapped for, once again, reasons. Barry still made his way into the game as a playable character in the Mercenaries, along with Rebecca, Excella, Wesker, and a few others. However, something most players won't know is that according to old records, Irving himself was not only supposed to be in the Mercenaries, but also playable in the story at some point. This content was cut for reasons, but more obvious ones. Now here's something we see during the concept art and original trailers of the game. The helicopter scene wasn't supposed to be just a quick QTE, it was a fully playable area. Why they didn't leave this in as at least a Mercenaries map is beyond me, given the odd and rather obscure places that made it into the fray instead. Original T-type zombies were supposed to appear, even if for a small amount of time during the course of the game, as well as Ouroboros creatures being commonplace enemies. Instead of that, however, they scrapped the idea and used the strange worm-like creatures in 7, and called them mold, probably because the idea was from 2005 and hadn't gotten enough sun from that point on. Earlier I said the enemies were mostly unchanged. This is true aside from the fact that the rather prominent Chainsaw Genie was supposed to be the executioner from the public assembly scene. Instead, they replaced him with this obtuse Lisa Trevor-looking creature with, Pyramid Head vibes. And the final change is the amount of enemies seen in these sequences. Through the chapters of Resident Evil 5, enemies are by no means scarce. However, they show scenes here with massive pools, hordes of enemies even. This was obviously reduced in the final release, but I'm not exactly sure why they didn't just change the enemy rate for higher or lower difficulties. It seems like a good idea. Now, onto the way the final product was and is one of the controversial and arguably worst titles of the franchise. The story is rather bland, that's nothing new with survival horror, and less so with campy, cheesy action horror genre games like Resident Evil. Granted, the recent 4 entries and the upcoming 4 remake are looking to delve back into that horror-esque line. However, in this case, the gameplay and gunplay take precedence over the rest of the game. The graphics were nothing insane back when the game was announced, and they certainly don't hold up that well. That's excusable, as it was a PS3 entry anyways. But graphics aside, multiplayer was something that a lot of fans aren't into in these sorts of games. That said, the reason the choice to make the game multiplayer wasn't the studio's decision alone. In fact, fans made it a bit of an outcry. According to some reports I found, now this is all speculation, but if it's true, Capcom did exactly as the fans asked. And the game blew up for a bit, only losing its novelty later on in its lifespan. probably during the development of Resident Evil 6, more than likely the reason that 6 was entirely built on multiplayer, much to a similar hindrance. But that's not the only thing 5 had stacked against it. Resident Evil 5 bolstered a fun set of mechanics, cooperative gameplay, replayability, collectibles that actually did something for the player and subsequent playthroughs, and even alternate stories, points of view, and game modes. To be honest, I'm biased. I love this game, quirks and oddities all. I've replayed it very frequently, and it's a fun way to introduce new people to the story and plot of the Biohazard universe. It has random facts and info about the lore throughout every load screen, so the player gets a rough timeline of events. Not enough to bore you, but more to entice you into seeking that information out. To learn more yourself. Whether that's finding out why Spencer did what he did, who the Ashfords are, or what the Kennedy report really was, it leads players to try more, and that's something I can't fault the game for. In the end, I'm not sure why people dislike this game as a whole. Sure, it has its annoying points, minor inconsistencies, and today's reboots of the series might even make it not canon to begin with. But, as a good friend of mine once said, if you don't see the bad, you won't realize what was good about it in the first place. And that concludes my dive into the changes, plot, and divergence of Resident Evil 5. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next episode of Investigaming. Oh, and there was supposed to be a merchant. This is him.